It's the thrill of one more kill, the last one to fall. Will never sacrifice their will. Don't ever look back on the world closing. Be on the attack with your wings on the wind. All the things will begin. And it's sweet, sweet, sweet victory. And it's ours for the taking. Warning.
Alrighty. All right, everyone. Welcome to another Wednesday. I hope you're all doing well. Um, so about your quizzes, we're going to finish grading those tonight. So we'll post your grades for those this evening. When I post those grades, I'll send out an email about recapture percentages, but recapture will be due next week. But I'll send out an email about that and post a place for you to submit it on Moodle, of course. Recapture will work the same as it does in the past, same setup. Once again, in good faith, answering questions, correcting yourself. You get back the percentage once again vary depending on the group grade, but yeah, I'll send an email about that later tonight. Any concerns or questions about anything before I jump into life history traits? No? All right. Great. Let's full screen this. Oh, yeah. All right. Great. All right, so today we're talking about life history traits and population dynamics. Um, and so we're talking about, in this one, diversity of life history traits. So what traits, what steps do organisms go through in their life, and how are they reactions to their environment, and how do organisms have different strategies in order to allocate resources? So we've talked a lot about energy, about how it gets propagated, how organisms collect their energy either by eating others or by producing it if they're a plant. Um, but resources, they take time, effort, and energy. They just even plants which are producing their own resources, or at least food, are taking resources, other resources, nitrogen, things from the soil, and using it to make energy. And so there's not only a finite amount of energy that is available to a single organism, but there's a finite amount of energy that is available in the entire population. And so when individual organisms are thinking about resources, they have a number of different functions, right? So they have reproduction, that they're trying to put energy into. So production of young, whether or not they're carrying young or producing eggs. You then have maintenance, which is keeping all your cells alive, making sure that they're doing well. Homeostasis, controlling your temperature, things like that. And then you have growth, right? So actually creating new cells, doing, if you're a plant, undergoing primary growth, secondary growth. And so generally we assume that organisms have a finite amount of resources, right? And so they're not capable of just allocating unlimited amounts to all of these, right? An organism is never going to be able to produce 1,000 babies that are all huge while simultaneously growing, to twice its size, while keeping itself perfectly homeostatic. There's got to be trade-offs to what organisms are actually going to allocate these different resources for. And so we'll talk about that, and then how this leads later to these different types of lifestyles of organisms. And so obviously, increased allocation of one function leads to reductions in the other, right? You don't have infinite amount of energy, you don't have infinite amount of time and effort. And so what you're choosing in order to focus on is what you're going to put the most energy into. And so life histories can vary very, very greatly depending on organisms, species, but they can also vary on individually. So organisms within a species. So for instance, clutch size varies with diet. So a spider that is been eating better is generally going to be larger, have more access to energy. But even if let's say that they are, the same size, they up until this point, two spiders have been sitting in a web, they're the exact same size, everything is the same. That spider who's going to be eating more recently is going to have the excess energy and resources and nutrients in order to make more eggs. So even within the same species, even with a lot of the same base things, something as simple as how much and what you're eating can change how much you're able to produce and put into reproduction. And so all of these also vary, as I said, based on your evolutionary niche. Like, where are you getting your energy from? What resources do you have available to you? And which do you have to provide yourself? And which do you have to get from another organism? And so we ask the question of, how do you optimize and allocate these resources, right? How do organisms do that? And so it turns into that, once again, like everything else in evolution, it's all about trade-offs, right? And so, for instance, I was saying it's all about trade-offs, right? So let's focus on reproduction for a second. If you are, putting resources into producing eggs or offspring, there are usually two different types of techniques. And again, these are trade-offs, right? You can either put your energy and nutrients and resources into producing larger offspring, because again, you're producing eggs, but those eggs aren't able to get, or a child or something, they're unable to get energy, growth, anything from the outside world, right? They're getting everything from you. And so only what you have, that limited resources that you have to invest, are what's going to be put into it. And so generally, organisms are trading off between having low numbers of offspring that are very, very large, or a lot of offspring that are very, very small. And so this curve here, very simplistic, but this is the basic trade-off, right? And so you can think about it very simply as, the strategy of humans versus the strategy of insects, fish, spiders, right? Humans, we have one child every 9 months at max. That child is sitting in the belly for 9 months. It's getting all your nutrients. It's getting all your appropriate, energy requirements. But, that's going to be a decently sized baby. But you're only going to have one of them. Maybe, you might have twins, or, maybe even more, but like most likely the human body is going to produce one baby. Spiders, on the other hand, are going to produce hundreds, if not thousands, of eggs, right? Insects have the exact opposite ability. And so a lot of this actually has to do with how an organism is living their life, and again, their niche. So higher level organisms higher up on the food chain, who are less likely to be eaten, are going to be larger, be able to defend themselves, and more likely more individualistic, right? You're going to have one human, or one elephant baby. That's going to be a lot harder to kill than, say, 1,000 little spiders, right? And so in these organisms that are prey animals, generally they have a lot of offspring, hopefully they survive type of thing. And so, life histories exhibit patterns in their variability, aka, these trade-offs, right? And so, an organism's life history generally includes 3 main components. And then there are a lot of sub-life histories that can happen depending on this organism. But at first, you have the age of maturity. So when are you first able to reproduce? And what we'll see is this varies greatly between strategies, right? How quickly you're able to mature determines, how quickly you can start reproducing and how likely you are to pass on your genes. So the first stage, when you're able to reproduce, and then you have your frequency of reproduction. So I'll talk about, the fact that some organisms mate once in their life. They put all their eggs in one really good mating season in order to pass on their genes, and then they die. Certain other organisms, again, humans, elephants, you can, as long as you're healthy and have resources, you can be pregnant every 9 months. You can keep popping out a baby as frequently as you would like. Obviously, have health issues and monetary things. Kids are very expensive. I don't have any, but I've read about it. Professor Aiken can probably tell you more about that.
They're
But
very expensive. Very, very. Both in time, energy, and money. But
See,
wonderful.
Exactly. A perfect life history example, right? So you have your frequency of reproduction, how often you're doing that, and then the number of offspring produced, right? Once again, are you producing a clutch size of, because spiders, they can reproduce multiple times in a season. I'll have spiders that I'll catch on the farm, the preserve. I'll bring them into the greenhouse, and they will panic and they'll make an egg sac. And I'll take that egg sac away and I'll start feeding them. And then a few weeks later, they might produce another egg sac, right? So there is a mixture of these two things. So a lot of organisms can be very complicated in their combination of these traits. But again, how often you're reproducing and the number of offspring. But, this is an example of other life history traits. It can be much more extensive, right? So whether or not you have weaning and hatching. So, birds, for instance, their eggs will hatch, and then birds will feed their babies until they're mature enough, versus spiders, who, again, Charlotte's Web style, those eggs hatch and then those babies all distribute themselves, right? And so age in which you're weaning off your hatching, age of maturity, whether or not there's some type of sexual dimorphism. So whether men and women, males and females, sperm carriers, egg producers are each, because it's not that simple in most animal systems, are reaching maturity. And, that has a lot to say about how they survive. For instance, male spiders will mature much, much faster because they are smaller. They want to be able to hide, but also they are more likely to be picked off by predators because they're running around trying to find a female. And so some organisms have very early maturity for that reason. It's more advantageous to reach sexual maturity. You're more likely to pass on your genes. But yeah, duration of gestation, even organisms that are carrying their young, humans, as I said, 9 months, but I think whales carry theirs up to 18 months. I think, and then elephants are 12 months. So, like certain animals will carry their babies for a very, very long time. And so when we talk about these life history patterns, they usually fall into 2 major groups. So you have this semelparity, which is kind of described as this big bang reproduction. You reproduce once and you die. And so this is something that's done by a lot of fish, a lot of prey species, things such as, insects once again. Then you have the iteroparity, which is repeated reproduction, or reproduce offspring repeatedly. And so there is a difference between that, right? So depending on those population dynamics, again, spiders, for instance, spiders are not going to reproduce, many male spiders are not going to reproduce multiple times, most likely. They are going to be eaten by the female or eaten in nature. And so they're going to reproduce once, even though they're physically capable of doing it more times. And so same thing goes for, elephants, other organisms. Some species, the males will not survive reproduction. And so it depends on whether or not the females or the males, egg producers, sperm producers, as you go, will be able to, survive. And so what factors contribute to the evolution of these strategies, right? Where will you find these kinds of ideas? And so once again, if you're reproducing a lot of offspring at one time, you're likely going to have a scenario where you have very low survival of your offspring. Think again of those sea turtles that we were watching a video of last class, right? Those sea turtles are producing hundreds of eggs and they're hoping that only 8% of them survive, right? And so they also usually have, and this is part of why they have such low survival rates, but there's highly variable or unpredictable environments, right? You don't know how much energy is going to be in your particular subsection of the deep sea, right? You may not have the ability to do that. Or even so, maybe your adults are less likely to survive, right? Maybe you don't live in a colony, you're a single, like a salmon swimming around by yourself. You may not necessarily be part of a community, right? So the chance that you're going to get picked off by a bear is very random and very high. And so if the adults are less likely to survive, also, they're less likely to be able to reproduce more than once. And so they're going to, again, put all their eggs, into one basket, which is, I'm going to reproduce once in some giant thing. I'm going to shoot lots of eggs. I'm going to go to an area where someone's going to be shooting out lots of sperm. Hopefully that those combine and we produce thousands of babies, maybe, right? On the other end, generally organisms that are reproducing more than once have a high adult survival rate. Community animals, organisms that are, say, predators who are at the top of the food chain, less likely to die from something random, are going to have this strategy, right? Once again, it's advantageous because they live for many years, and so they're going to be able to produce many offspring. And so generally, this is in a dependable environment, one that has equal access to nutritions or cycles that are very well synced. But, it can also happen if there's like competition for resources, right? organisms are going to be allocating resources better because they're alive for longer. They're going to be, controlling their environment and themselves. And so perhaps these, elephants, once again, are going to be competing with other herbivores for resources such as grass and food. And so they may, be able to like eat, leave, come back, allocate their resources, eat more when they're pregnant, and they can kind of control their metabolism and their life depending on, whether or not they're reproducing or not. Whereas something on those lower end, right, these fish are most likely not going to be able to, they don't know that they're always going to be able to find food, right? They're more likely to be in an area where it might be starving or that food might be near predators. Think of organisms on a coral reef, right? Are you always going to be able to find that snail that you need to eat? Maybe not. And so since organisms have infinite resources, that leads to trade-offs between survival and reproduction. Because once again, if the adult does not survive, it doesn't matter if they're pregnant, right? And so generally, as I said, if you look at this example of these fish, there's actually, a trade-off between egg size and egg number. And so this could be something that, if they have more resources, they might be able to produce, a little bit bigger eggs. But this is interspecies variation, right? Organisms that are producing very, very large eggs are producing much less of them. Sorry, over here. Yeah, much larger eggs are producing much less of them. And those that are producing a lot of eggs are smaller. And so plants and animals whose young are subject to high rates of mortality often produce large amounts of eggs, and those eggs are usually of very, very small organisms. And so that trade-off is many resources into small organisms or small amount into large offspring. And so as my weird example from nature for this, I have this adorable little mouse, right? Why is it so cute? So this is a mammal. It is one of the only mammals that shows that similarity, right? So that is the act of reproducing only once in one session, one season. And so this is very rare for mammals. Generally speaking, as I said, it's going to be fish. It's going to be insects that are these kind of prey animals, right? So the thing that's really interesting about these organisms is the reason that they only made once is because first of all, these are found in Australia. These are marsupials, which if you ever want to look at very interesting evolution, look at marsupials in Australia. They have so many strange adaptations because they generally don't have too many predators. So think of like a koala, like koalas live in trees eating eucalyptus. They're pretty much high off of that for like 20 hours a day. They really can't defend themselves. How can you evolve that lifestyle? There's nothing that's really going to eat you. They're kind of gamey and gross, and they don't really have nutritional value. But so this organism has a very strange behavior. And so what they do is the males, and so this is an example of, again, females can mate for multiple seasons, but males are going to mature faster and they're only going to live for one season. And what they do that's interesting is they actually are so excited to mate that they actually down-regulate their immune system. So they take all their energy out of fighting bacteria, fighting pathogens, and they put it into reproduction. They upregulate production of sperm, they store sperm, they start getting themselves kind of adrenalined up to be able to mate for longer. And so they actually die either from like internal bleeding, from damaging themselves, or from infection because their immune system is so weak. And so they do this in order to, once again, make sure that they're mating with as many females as possible in one session, and then they die. And so I'm going to show you this Discovery Channel video on them. It's actually very good because it also not only talks about, where is it? Not only do they talk about, why this organism might have evolved it in terms of life history, but it also talks about their natural environment and kind of gives you clues as to why they might do that. Oh, there we go. Oh, well,
If you
sorry about this. Let's wait.
marsupial mammals called Antechinus has facilitated classification of another new species, this one named the Tasman Peninsula dusky Antechinus. These animals are small, mousy carnivores that live in Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea, with their claim to fame, suicidal sex. Yes, that's right. Antechinus males have sex until they literally can't do it anymore. Male Antechinus literally train for the task of mating, banking sperm and suppressing their immune systems to give themselves more energy for the marathon act of passing on their genetic material. During a mating season that lasts only a few weeks, testosterone-fueled males engage in what has been described as an extreme form of speed mating. In that time, males attempt to have sex with as many females as possible, lasting for anywhere from 12 to 14 hours before their bodies literally self-destruct. Scientists at Queensland University of Technology say that these animals are biochemically driven to give it their all before, ultimately, the high level of testosterone triggers a malfunction in the inhibition of stress hormones. Once stress hormones begin to flood their body, the immune system of these overtaxed males begins to collapse, and the animal usually dies of hemorrhage or infection before they can see the fruits of their labor. What drives males to these extremes? Scarcity of food and sexual competition. Antechinus aren't the only animals who mate until they die. Suicidal reproduction is called semelparity, and salmon, as well as some frogs, lizards, and many insects reproduce this way. But while not rare in nature, it is unusual to see semelparity in mammals, and all of the species that exhibit this behavior are insect-eating marsupials. The narrow window of the mating season is thought to follow the boom-bust nature of the insect life cycle, synchronizing Antechinus reproduction so that females raise their young at times when food or insects are most abundant. The intensity of the resulting sexual competition also works out for females who benefit by mating promiscuously and just letting the best sperm win. This anomaly of evolution may sound like all play and no work, but the inefficiency of the mating practice combined with severely reduced natural habitat is cutting each generation of the Antechinus population in half. And scientists have already requested this newly discovered marsupial be placed on the threatened species list, leading one to speculate that this might be an evolutionary dead end. Is there any other weird animal behavior?
So
Right.
this is not like evolutionary beneficial?
So it was evolutionally beneficial, to a point, right? These organisms do exist and they have been doing this, and there are many species who do it. But when we talk about food webs and all of these different features that connect environments, in the next unit and the rest of this unit, sometimes it stops being advantageous, right? So the reason that scientists believe that these organisms are doing this suicidal mating is because they need to sync up with the reproductive cycle of insects, right? Insects reproduce every couple of weeks, every couple of months. If you go outside, one day there'll be lots of gnats and mosquitoes, and then they will disappear for maybe a few days, and then they'll come back up, right? They're doing these quick cycles. And so these organisms have evolved in order to try to follow that cycle. But at this point, because of habitat loss, I'm sure that all of the wildfires in Australia didn't help. It's becoming less and less advantageous, right? So it was at some point, but it's slowly becoming not. And human interference can help with that, or maybe there's just something that's doing it better at this point, or maybe they've somehow desynced with the insect population to an extent. But there are times where stuff stops being evolutionarily advantageous for their environment and organisms start to die out. And so it's not the most efficient system, and maybe it worked for a while, but it's slowly stopping. And so they're just talking about this one species. Maybe there are areas, they said, like New Guinea, right? Maybe the species in New Guinea are doing fine. It's the change in Australia. So we'd have to check from an area, but the only mammals who do it are these small small mammals. And so one other thing that about these like maturity and reproduction is the idea that, when before you hit sexual maturity, you're doing two things, right? Organisms are doing maintenance, homeostasis, repairing cells, and then they're growing. They're just actively working to grow and mature. But there are also strategies about how this ends, right? So some animals choose to grow after they start to reproduce, right? Humans continue to grow after they become sexually mature. You know, and so when we're doing stuff like that, we are allocating our resources as such, right? We're putting resources into continuing to grow, maintaining ourselves, and then into reproducing and producing, you know, any type of gametes that we might have. On the other end, other animals don't do that, right? Again, these organisms that are going to die immediately after reproduction are probably not going to do that. And so, as just a simplification, right, these organisms are no longer putting that energy towards growth, right? They're able to allocate their limited resources to being able to maintain themselves and then produce this reproductive stuff. And so, sorry if you hear a lot of banging; those are the monster dogs we have upstairs. But yeah, so they're changing it and they're doing reproduction versus maintenance. And so again, this talks a lot about lifestyles, right? How much access to stuff do you have? And so if you're maturing early, it increases the probability of surviving to maturity, right? Just makes sense. If it takes a year for you to mature, you have, you know, twice as much time to get picked off by a predator if it only takes you 6 months to mature. And again, you know, spiders get eaten by things, right? Wasps, other spiders, and so they may try to mature much faster, which does mean that they grow up faster, and then those organisms will produce more offspring. This is like a shorter list. I've tried to think about it, but like delayed maturation, beyond the fact of like decreased, you know, survivability to maturity, theoretically has a lot more possible you know, advantages in an environment. So for instance, you know, obviously they're going to reach a larger size. Generally, organisms who are growing for years are going to be larger than those who are smaller. I mean, you know, insects, right? Like lizards are bigger than insects. Even spiders that live longer, think of tarantulas, are much bigger than the ones that you find in the field or on grass, or, you know, jumping spiders on your house who are just going to die in a season, right? So they have a longer time to grow, so they'll reach a larger size, which hopefully means they won't get picked off as easily. But being larger, you can have higher reproductive capacity, so you can produce more eggs. You also have the ability to, you know, mate multiple times, and produce produce offsprings more often. So you're going to be improved parental care, you know, because you live longer. So instead of having your eggs and running away and those eggs hopefully surviving, elephants, humans, we take care of our offspring. Our offspring are able to survive even though they're pretty, you know, human babies are like completely incapable of taking care of themselves. They can't even hold up their heads, right? And so we have to provide care in order to make sure that they survive. But that leads to an overall higher survival rate of those organisms. Again, you can think of this as those survivorship curves that we talked about last class. You know, delayed nutrition generally leads to a type 1 curve like humans, right? But this early nutrition is going to be those type 3 curves. And so you'll see that some of these are kind of, they're not exactly synonyms, but they're terms that go with one another that describe similar adaptions, right? And so we're talking about these growth curves. You know, these might as well be like survivorship curves, right? They're just showing like a different aspect of it, right? This is showing like multiple generations instead of a single cohort. So if you were looking at a survivorship curve, you'd probably look at, you know, this one set and then you would stop, right? Because you're looking at one generation over time. And so these life history patterns are broken up into 2 types of species, similar to like the breakdown of the survivorship curves. But most organisms are going to fall somewhere in between these, right? There's way too many environmental things that are going on in order to really be able to predict exactly how these are going to work, right? And so our K-selected species, are those organisms with a type 1 survivorship curve, right? So they have a low growth rate. These organisms are reaching maturity slower, but they're able to survive, once again, and they're expensive offspring. If anyone plays video games and you know StarCraft, this is akin to these Protoss, right? They are individual units that are very expensive, but they're powerful, they're big, and they have a high level of survivability each. On the other end, once again, you have this R-selected species. And so these have a high growth rate, meaning that they're reaching maturity really fast. They're cheap units, quote unquote, which means that they are producing a lot of offspring very, very quickly. Again, insects. This is akin to the Zerg in StarCraft once again. And so the way that you can kind of distinguish these, if you're just looking at a curve, is when you look at K-selected species, a population size will increase until the carrying capacity, you know, the largest amount of organisms the environment can sustain. And then it's going to fluctuate a little bit, right? As organisms live and die, if you remember those survivorship curves, you know, the population kind of stays stagnant and then they die, they increase. But those organisms, since they're all surviving, the total population over a year is not going to vary nearly as much. However, when you look at these R-selected species, these are those insects that are doing boom burst, right? So you have an egg sac that opens up. Oh, all of those eggs hatch. We've introduced 1,000 spiders into the environment. 960 of those spiders get eaten by birds and other things before they reach maturity. Your population drops back down. Those few that were able to survive each once again produce thousands upon thousands of offspring, and then the population jumps back up. And so the fluctuation around this carrying capacity is much, much bigger for our selected species. And so if you look at it up here, there's kind of this this thing that's saying density independent versus density dependent. So think about it this way, you know, our selected species are density independent because the organisms are all hatching and spreading out, and most of them are not surviving. So the chances of them being able to like interact in a meaningful way, help each other survive, are going to be much less likely. Those organisms that have high parental care, that are putting a lot of energy into very specific, you know, offspring to have them survive, are going to be density dependent, right? They're going to have to be competing with resources over time. Most likely populations are going to be inhibited by one another. So, you know, we'll talk about this later, but there are feedback loops, right? In which organisms are going to be stopped from reproducing by the presence of others, either by competition or by predation and things like that. And so, you know, looking at all of these different, the flood from Halo, exactly, yes. Very common. I do enjoy that, you know. I think as a common like side critique of like humanity, we are very interested in things that are different from us. So I feel like a lot of times in video games or in literature, like organisms that are very foreign to us or evil are often like our selected species, right? They're often like insectoid based, like organisms that are hive mind, or, you know, are producing a lot of these like offspring. I feel like usually like the villain evil races are these are selected, right? They're different from us. They have a different life history. And so Starship Troopers, yes. So good. So many good examples. But yeah, just to kind of sum all these up, you know, R selected for K selected. Again, if you just look down here, right, type 3 survivorship curve. You know, K-selected organisms are going to have 1 or 2. Once again, they're going to be somewhere in between, you know, this rapid death and taking care of their offspring. And so, you know, this will vary a lot, right? Like birds are technically survivorship curve 2, so they would be K-selected, right? They are producing a fewer offsprings, you know, like 6 eggs. They are developing slowly. Those birds need to feed their offspring. You know, for those offspring to survive, they're going to grow and they're going to mature much, much later. So for instance, you know, birds, humans, elephants, babies need to be taken care of when they hatch. Spiders, when they hatch, they already know how to make webs. They know how to fly on the wind. Everything is innate, and they are not learning from others. They are just reaching maturity very quickly, rapidly developing, and then trying to spread. And so once again, this kind of comes down to this unpredictability in environments. So you remember that marsupial I was just talking about, one of the few are selected mammals. And so their environment is unpredictable in the fact that it doesn't necessarily have access to free nutrients, right? Their environment needs to respond to the availability of insects. And so they have a predictable environment in the way that they need to follow a very set schedule, right? If their natural environment is not providing everything that they need, resources, things such as those organisms, their ability to survive, they aren't going to be able to provide for their young and survive. And so they're going to be those R-selected organisms. And so we have density independent factors. So we have these factors that are going to affect organisms no matter what, right? In an environment, no matter how many there are, as long as you are there, this might be able to affect you. And so these are primarily abiotic, so things that are naturally in the environment, right? So pollutants, things that are produced by other organisms, but humans, pollution that we pop into the environment. Once again, saltiness is going to be in an environment, right? Specifically for plants, right? These plants are not going to be able to remove that salt, so the salt will help define what can grow there. But then you have climate extremes, right? So if you remember back to my environmental limitations, right, you have those tide pools. So you can have an environment that's constantly changing. It could be, the amount of water that's there. It could be, in this case, we're talking about extreme climate, just temperature, right? There are certain places, I don't know if you've, been to Florida, like Florida will be sunny and 90 degrees, it will then rain, and then it will hail in like the same day. And so, like organisms in those environments need to be able to deal with high temperatures, but also be able to, oh, it's hailing, I need to be able to take cover, and need to have an environmental response to this. And so same. Oh yeah, I lived in Ohio for 6 years. The amount of time that was sunny and I parked my car and went into my house, and then I came out and there was somehow flakes of snow in my car, drove me crazy. It was like living in the Matrix, I swear. Right? And so, and then you have, things that animals again can't control, which are just, catastrophic factors, fires, hurricanes. These things might, destroy habitats. And again, it doesn't matter how many organisms are living there if that land is destroyed. And so population is going to be regulated, also through density dependent factors. So factors that affect these organisms that are living in colonies. And so, those are going to be those primary biotic factors, right? And they're going to be coming from interactions between organisms within the same species, and then organisms of the outside. And so, you have predation, right? So you have, the amount of fish that live in a pond. The more that there are, the more likely that those fish can be eaten by a snapping turtle or something, right? The more likely you're going to come into contact with an organism. You then have competition for resources. So, this is competition for mates. This is competition for food. In the savannah, they're talking about cheetahs. Cheetahs are actually starting to go extinct. And part of it is not because they can't catch food, but it's because they're catching food, and then hyenas are out competing them and taking their resources. Obviously, you have disease, which is, another level of interaction, either viral or biotic. But again, you can think of, this disease and predation kind of work like those fungus, right? The more organisms you have, the more likely someone's going to get sick, the more likely you can catch that disease from someone, right? This is exactly what it's like in terms of, herd immunity and COVID, right? You know, the more people that are together, the more likely it can get passed on and not just be a dead end in one. Let's see. Would parasitic species be R or K selected species? Their survival is dependent on the density of other species, but I presume they reproduce a lot of offspring. Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Professor Aiken. I think that it's probably a mixture, and or depending on the species, it'll be both. So like tapeworms do live longer. They are producing a lot of offspring. But I'm trying to think. It might be one of those gray areas because their environments are that's a really good question, because their environments are consistent in the fact that they're in a prey as long as the prey is alive. So I'm not sure. I'm going to say that they're probably overall are selected, producing a lot of offspring, hoping that those offspring are like, again, kind of like that parasitic fungus. They're producing a lot and hoping that they go into, you know, those spores and hope it falls into an ant and then they go up. So I would say there's probably a mixture, but closer to R. Oh, you're right. Yep. And there are a lot of different phases depending on whether or not some parasites need vectors. And so, yeah, so it can be switched through their life cycles. That's a really good point. Thank you. Let's see. All right. So other factors, accumulation of wastes, obviously in the environment. Intrinsic factors, so general just genetic variation is going to affect organisms and how they relate to one another. Again, whether or not that makes one organism better at competing, or or the evolution of, say, a predator and being easier to catch prey, things of that nature. But the idea is that instead of being, like these density independent factors in which they're just there, the environment is happening, organisms have to respond to it, density dependent factors regulate population by providing what's called negative feedback on the population. And so it prevents unlimited population growth, right? And so it reduces birth rates or increases death rates. So for instance, again, the more organisms you have of a population, the more likely you're going to run into a predator, right? And so the more likely those organisms will die. And so when we talk about population dynamics, we talk about the interactions and factors that cause variation in population size. So for instance, from your textbook, predator-prey interactions. If you look at these curves, we have these two, right? So we have time on the x-axis, and then we have number of organisms on the y-axis. And so these organisms are on two different scales because, the number of moose just vastly outpopulate the number of wolves, and we'll talk about that why in a little bit. But if you look at these population curves, every time you have an increase in moose population, you generally have an increase in wolf population, right? You have more prey that can be eaten, so more predators can be sustained. Less of those wolves are going to starve to death in the environment because there are more resources. There are more moose that are out there. This part here is a little iffy. This might be when we started killing wolves a little bit more, so their populations aren't bursting as much. But, every time the prey population goes up, predator population goes up, and then prey population drops. And so there's this cyclical nature to these interactions and stuff like that. At least when you have these biotic factors. Then you have this idea again of density dependence. So in this, we're looking at fish that are in, kelp in an environment. The more that you have in an environment, the more likely, again, that they're going to run into a different type of predator. And so if you have only a few fish that are reproducing, not going to get caught, hard to find, you're only going to have a small mortality, right? Only 20% are going to die. But once you have this lake that's filled with fish and those predators, there's more predators that are able to reproduce and have enough resources in order to produce even more predators. So again, whatever is eating these perch, as these perch go up, just like the moose, their predators are going to go up. And so then all of a sudden their perches are going to die being eaten. And then most likely there's a higher percentage of them that are going to be picked off. The aliens from Alien, yes, exactly, right? They are like a weird mixture of both. They're kind of these parasites, but then they also, you know, are reproducing. They would probably be, yeah, they're also you know, they're parasites, but they don't take care of their young. But they also mature very, very quickly, right? Those aliens, you know, feed off of something, and then 10 minutes later in the movie, they're giant, right? And so, oh, yes. So Elizabeth is saying, isn't the opposite true of these dynamics? Like the reason we reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone. Yes, exactly. Think of it again as when we were talking about deer. If you replace moose with deer, you know, you have deer that are in the environment. These organisms might not be good at allocating resources, in the fact that like deer will eat anything. And so deer are going to be eating all the plants, and then they're most likely, if you think about this curve, right, let's add plants to it, right? Annotate, draw. So we're also going to have this, right? As you have an increase in, say, plant number, you're going to have more and more herbivores. As you have this increase in, say, moose population who are now eating those plants, your plants are going to go down. And so this being a you know, just two interactions, if we even add just plants, there's that third interaction. Right now we have three systems that are oscillating with each other. And so introducing wolves to Yellowstone is trying to create balance, right? It's trying to create these cyclical cycles, instead of, once again, you know, if you remove all of these wolves, what is this moose population going to do? If we don't do anything about it, it's not going to stop. It's instead going to be exponential, and then they're going to run out of resources, and then it's going to drop off, and you're going to have that death phase. So exactly, everything in balance. And so you have wolf hunting, but you also have, oh yeah, exactly. So that's why, you know, we hunt, there's wolf hunting, but like we also hunt deer. That's a reason why, you know, we can't get rid of deer season. You know, we got rid of all the wolves, and so most of these environments with deer, they're going to overpopulate and kill themselves. And so we need to hunt deer in order to keep deer from starving to death. And so there depends on, you know, the setup really depends on the environment, right? Different states, different environments might have different bursts of deer. So their hunting seasons might vary, or maybe it's a certain number they try to cull every season. You know, there's a lot of different, we'll talk about conservation, but there's a lot of different ways that scientists and people try to control these. But it is a very iffy system, right? If you get rid of all of the wolves, again, you're going to create these different population dynamics. All right. And so the last thing I have for you today is just talking about this idea of feedback loops. So feedback loops are talking about, you know, these density depending factors and how organisms interact with one another to kind of control the populations and how the environment's limiting it. So this is going to be, I'm not going to show all of it because it's a longer video, but you know, if you want to, I would suggest watching it in full when you have time. But it is a TED Talk. So let's talk a little bit about this.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. When your band is trying to perform, feedback is an annoying obstacle. But in the grand orchestra of nature, feedback is not only beneficial, it's what makes everything work. What exactly is feedback? The key element, whether in sound, the environment, or social science, is a phenomenon called mutual causal interaction, where X affects Y, Y affects X, and so on, creating an ongoing process called a feedback loop. And the natural world is full of these mechanisms, formed by the links between living and non-living things, that build resilience by governing the way populations and food webs respond to events. When plants die, the dead material enriches the soil with humus, a stable mass of organic matter, providing moisture and nutrients for other plants to grow. The more plants grow and die, the more humus is produced, allowing even more plants to grow, and so on. This is an example of positive feedback, an essential force in the buildup of ecosystems. But it's not called positive feedback because it's beneficial. Rather, it is positive because it amplifies a particular effect or change from previous conditions. These positive or amplifying loops can also be harmful, like when removing a forest makes it vulnerable to erosion, which removes organic matter and nutrients from the earth, leaving less plants to anchor the soil and leading to more erosion. In contrast, negative feedback diminishes or counteracts changes in an ecosystem to maintain a more stable balance. Consider predators and their prey. When lynx eat snowshoe hares, they reduce their population. But this drop in the lynx's food source will soon cause their own population to decline, reducing the predation rate and allowing the hare population to increase again. The ongoing cycle creates an up and down wave-like pattern, maintaining a long-term equilibrium and allowing a food chain to persist over time. Feedback processes might seem counterintuitive because many of us are used to more predictable linear scenarios of cause and effect. For instance, it seems simple enough that spraying pesticides would help plants grow by killing pest insects, but it may trigger a host of other unexpected reactions. For example, if spraying pushes down the insect population, its predators will have less food. As their population dips, the reduced predation would allow the insect population to rise, counteracting the effects of our pesticides. Note that each feedback is the product of the links in the loop. Add one negative link and it will reverse the feedback force entirely. And one weak link will reduce the effect of the entire feedback considerably. Lose a link and the whole loop is broken. But this is only a simple example, since natural communities consist not of separate food chains, but networks of interactions. Feedback loops will often be indirect, occurring through longer chains. A food web containing 20 populations can generate thousands of loops, of up to 20 links in length. But instead of forming a disordered cacophony, feedback loops in ecological systems play together, creating regular patterns just like multiple instruments coming together to create a complex but harmonious piece of music. Wide-ranging negative feedbacks keep the positive feedbacks in check, like drums maintaining a rhythm. You can look at the way a particular ecosystem functions within its unique habitat as representing its trademark sound. Ocean environments, dominated by predator-prey interactions and strong negative and positive loops stabilized by self-damping feedback, are powerful and loud, with many oscillations. Desert ecosystems, where the turnover of biomass is slow and the weak feedbacks loop through dead matter, are more like a constant drone. And the tropical rainforest, with its great diversity of species, high nutrient turnover, and strong feedbacks among both living and dead matter, is like a lush panoply of sounds. Despite their stabilizing effects, many of these habitats and their ecosystems develop and change over time, as do the harmonies they create.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed the video on feedback loops. So that's all I have for you today. Once again, I'll post this online, and if you have any questions, I will be here.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Just like chemical equilibrium. Exactly. It's all the same on different scales.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was a bit confused in the textbook about territoriality and how that limits population density.
Sure. So that limits population density, as it's a density dependent factor, right? So like organisms that are going to be territorial are essentially saying this area, all these resources are mine. And so if you come into this area, I'm going to kill you. And so you're not going to be able to reproduce. And so this is what happens with generally like larger predators. This is actually a reason why you can't have spider farms, because like, you know, if you try to get a lot of spider silk and you put all spiders in one area, they're just going to eat one another, right? Anytime they get close to each other, they're going to fight and they're going to get eaten. And so populations can't get too big, because as soon as you get too many of an organism, they're going to start to overlap in their areas and their amount of resources. And so it's going to be, you know, similar to like this type of predator prey interaction, right? Whereas, or I guess, you know, this kelp thing, as you increase the amount of these territorial organisms in an area, the more likely they're going to come into contact with another one of their species, and then they're going to have to decide who has that area. And so again, it's allocation of resources. They won't be able to get access to resources. If you're getting pushed out, you've eaten everything in your area, say, you know, you're a deer, you go to another deer's area, they have lush grass and food, they can eat well, they kick you out, you're going to go starve somewhere else, right? So that's going to be one of those negative, you know, those negative type things.
Okay. This is kind of not related, but I was just wondering, since that wasn't really in the lecture, is that something I'm going to need to know?
The territoriality thing specifically? No.
Yeah, or just like any of these other things that are in the textbook that are not covered in lecture.
No. I'm not going to ask you things that are not on my lectures.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I didn't understand age structure, I don't really need to understand age structure.
No, you don't. If you want, we can like go
Okay.
over stuff and things like that, but it's not going to be.
I'll just jump in quickly to make a point though. One way to think about those topics that aren't covered in lecture is, can you use the concepts in lecture to understand them? Can you use them to reinforce the concepts covered in lecture, right? Sort of like as a study tool. Like, I mean, I think that's the way to think about that other material, right? There are other examples of that, you know, use similar concepts. And so it might be a way to like test, do I really understand this? Because if I do, then I should be able to look over there and understand that thing. You know.
Okay.
I'll defer to Prof. Diaz, of course.
No, that was a really good point, right? All the textbook is showing you all of these examples as ways of like, you know, the environment is just so dynamic. There's so many species doing so many things that you can look at these relationships and notice them in a lot of different scenarios. Again, you know, territoriality is, you know, an extension of population, you know, density dependence. And so completely right. Like, hopefully, you know, some of those concepts, if they're tied, you should be able to be like, oh, at least be comfortable, like, how might territoriality affect density dependence? You know, how is affecting it? But no, I'm not going to specifically.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Take care.
Cool. I got to go to office hours, but I sent you my